When we open history books, something immediately stands out. Not because it is clearly written, but because it is silently repeated so often that we stop questioning it. We are introduced to heroes, conquerors, victors, men who acted without hesitation, men who never seemed to doubt. History celebrates those who burned cities, those who ruled through fear, those who made decisions that cost thousands of lives and never looked back. But beneath all these stories, one question remains strangely untouched. If mercy is a human virtue, if compassion is considered moral strength, if the value of a human life is sacred, why didn't history choose mercy? Why did history remember the ruthless but forget the kind? Is this coincidence, or is history speaking a language we don't like to hear? Because history does speak, just not in the way we wish it did. History tells us something uncomfortable. It tells us that mercy is beautiful, but dangerous. Mercy creates hesitation. Mercy creates doubt. Mercy invites questions. And history does not favor those who ask questions. History favors speed. It favors decisiveness. It favors those who act, even when they are wrong. This is why the heroes of history are rarely merciful. They do not pause. They do not forgive. They do not stand still and ask, what if? Because what if does not build empires. What if does not maintain armies. What if does not produce obedience. Across centuries, the most powerful forces on earth learned the same lesson again and again. It is far easier to rule people through fear than through understanding. Fear works immediately. Mercy requires time, and history is impatient. Empires are impatient. Power is impatient. Authority is impatient, because power is always afraid of losing control, afraid of losing respect, afraid of losing itself. And a fearful power has no room for mercy. Throughout history, mercy has often been labeled weakness. A forgiving ruler was seen as unstable. A retreating commander was seen as dangerous. A leader who valued human life was seen as unreliable. Because mercy creates a chain reaction. If you spare one person today, others will expect to be spared tomorrow, and soon people will begin to ask, why should we be afraid? And that question terrifies history, because when fear disappears, obedience disappears with it. Perhaps that is why history never embraced mercy, or perhaps the truth is even more unsettling. Maybe history didn't choose cruelty because it was evil, but because cruelty is loud. Burning a city creates history. Saving a life does not. Spilling blood creates records. Forgiveness leaves silence. History remembers noise. It forgets quiet acts. And this video exists inside that silence. It is not about the victors alone. It is about those who did not win, but remained human. This is not a video that gives answers. It is a video that asks whether the way history remembers is the way we should live. Because maybe history did not fail. Maybe history simply recorded power and ignored value. And perhaps the heaviest question is not, why didn't history choose mercy? But rather, if history didn't choose mercy, will we? Mercy was not rejected by history because it lacked beauty. It was rejected because it created uncertainty, and uncertainty has always terrified power. From the earliest forms of organized rule, leaders faced a problem that never truly changed: how to control large groups of people who do not personally know you, who do not love you, and who will never meet you. There were only two reliable tools: fear or belief. Belief takes time. Fear works immediately. And history, again and again, chose what worked faster. Mercy slows decisions down. It introduces hesitation where authority demands certainty. It opens space for reflection in systems that survive on obedience. A merciful leader must ask questions. A ruthless one does not. And history has always favored those who did not ask. When a ruler shows mercy, something subtle but dangerous happens. people begin to imagine alternatives. They begin to think that punishment is not inevitable, that power can bend, that authority can hesitate. And once people realize this, control becomes fragile. This is why mercy was interpreted not as strength, but as a crack in the system. In ancient societies, power depended on predictability. If laws were absolute, people adapted. If punishments were consistent, fear stabilized behavior. Mercy disrupted that balance, because mercy creates exceptions, and exceptions create expectations. If one man is spared today, another will ask to be spared tomorrow. Soon, mercy stops being a gift and becomes a demand. History learned very early that demands weaken authority. This is why merciful rulers were often described as soft, indecisive, or dangerous. Not because they were morally wrong, but because they made systems harder to manage. Empires are not built for moral complexity. They are built for efficiency, and efficiency has little patience for compassion. Mercy requires time to understand context, time to listen, time to weigh consequences. Power does not want to listen, it wants to move. Throughout history, rulers who hesitated were replaced by those who did not. Commanders who spared enemies were removed by those who crushed them. Leaders who valued human life were overthrown by those who treated people as numbers. Not because the merciful were wrong, but because they were slower. History does not reward slowness, it rewards momentum. This is why mercy came to be associated with weakness, not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked speed. Fear creates instant results. Mercy creates long-term trust, but long-term trust is fragile. It can be broken by one failure, one famine, one defeat. Fear survives crises. Mercy does not always. And so, in moments of instability, during wars, rebellions, plagues, and collapses, leaders abandon mercy first, because mercy is hardest to maintain when it is needed most. There is also another darker reason why mercy was rejected. Mercy humanizes, and power depends on dehumanization. It is easier to rule people when they are categories instead of individuals, soldiers instead of sons, subjects instead of families, enemies instead of humans. Mercy breaks this illusion. To show mercy, you must see the person in front of you. And once you see them, violence becomes heavier, decisions become harder. History prefers leaders who do not see. This is why the most celebrated figures of history are often emotionally distant. They do not tremble. They do not reflect publicly. They do not reveal doubt, because doubt weakens authority in the eyes of the masses. Mercy reveals doubt, and doubt in the language of power is weakness. Over time, this logic hardened into tradition. Children were taught that strength meant domination, that leadership meant control, that mercy was a private virtue, not a public one. It was acceptable to be merciful as a person, but dangerous to be merciful as a ruler. History made that distinction very clear, and perhaps this is the cruelest irony of all. Mercy was not rejected because it failed. It was rejected because it threatened the structure that preserved power. History did not misunderstand mercy. It understood it perfectly, and that is why it feared it. Power has never ruled alone. It has always relied on something older, something more instinctive, something deeply human. Fear. Not fear as panic, not fear as chaos, but fear as structure. Because fear, when carefully managed, creates order. From the moment societies grew beyond small tribes, leaders discovered a difficult truth. You cannot personally know everyone you rule. You cannot negotiate with every individual, and you cannot depend on love when distance replaces familiarity. So power learned to speak a simpler language. Fear does not require explanation. Fear does not ask questions. Fear does not need agreement. Fear only needs consistency. When people know exactly what will happen if they disobey, they do not need to be convinced. They adjust. And adjustment is the foundation of control. Control is not maintained through constant violence. That is a misunderstanding history often corrects too late. True control is quieter. It exists when punishment is rarely used but always expected. When people behave not because a sword is raised, but because they know it could be. This is why fear became the most efficient tool of power. It works internally. Once fear is absorbed, authority no longer needs to intervene constantly. People police themselves, they silence each other, they repeat the rules without being forced. And power watches. This relationship between fear and control is fragile but incredibly effective, because fear simplifies the world. It turns complex moral questions into binary choices: obey or suffer, submit or disappear, align or be removed. There is no space for nuance here, and power thrives in environments without nuance. Mercy complicates this system. Mercy introduces unpredictability. If punishment is not guaranteed, fear weakens. If authority hesitates, people notice. And when people notice hesitation, control begins to erode. This is why power reacts so aggressively to mercy during moments of crisis. Wars, rebellions, economic collapse, social unrest. In these moments, power tightens its grip, not because it is strong, but because it is afraid. Afraid that fear itself might fail. Control requires emotional distance. A ruler who sees individuals instead of populations will struggle to maintain authority. A commander who sees faces instead of formations will hesitate. And hesitation in systems built on obedience is lethal. This is why power historically demanded emotional hardness. Leaders were trained not to feel publicly, not to mourn openly, not to doubt visibly, because emotions humanize, and humanization weakens control. Fear dehumanizes. It reduces people to roles, functions, numbers, subjects instead of neighbors, enemies instead of humans, casualties instead of lives. This reduction is not accidental, it is essential. Once people are reduced, decisions become easier, orders move faster, resistance becomes abstract, and power survives. Control also depends on repetition. Fear must be renewed through rituals, through punishments, through public examples. History is filled with spectacles of control. Executions, exiles, humiliations, not because power enjoyed cruelty, but because it needed witnesses. Fear is contagious. Seeing someone punished teaches thousands without a word being spoken. This is why mercy is so dangerous to control. Mercy breaks the spectacle. It interrupts the lesson. When punishment is withheld, the audience becomes confused. They begin to ask why. They begin to imagine alternatives, and imagination is the enemy of control. Power does not collapse when people rebel. It collapses when people stop believing rebellion is impossible. Fear maintains the illusion of inevitability. Mercy dissolves it. This is why the most stable systems of control appear calm on the surface. There is order, there is predictability, there is silence. But beneath that silence is not peace, it is restraint. And restraint is sustained by fear. History did not choose fear because it was evil. It chose fear because it was reliable. Reliable across cultures, reliable across centuries, reliable even when leaders failed. Fear does not require intelligence. It does not require wisdom. It does not require moral authority. It only requires consistency. And so power embraced fear, not as a weapon of last resort, but as architecture, the invisible framework that holds obedience in place long after the ruler is gone. This is the true tragedy, because fear can build empires, but it cannot build trust. It can enforce order, but it cannot create meaning. And yet, history returned to it again and again. because control felt safer than uncertainty, and silence felt safer than compassion. Power, fear, and control did not form an alliance by accident. They formed it because together they work. A person who does not think obeys, not because obedience is noble, but because obedience is easier than responsibility. Because when someone obeys without thinking, the weight of choice is lifted from their shoulders and placed onto an authority above them, allowing the conscience to rest while the mind stays quiet. A person who does not think does not ask questions, because questions are dangerous. Because the moment you ask why, you are no longer just a tool carrying out instructions. You become an individual examining meaning, intention, and consequence. And throughout history, individuality has always been more threatening to power than open rebellion. A person who does not think does not resist, because resistance is not born from anger alone. It is born from reflection, from comparison, from the internal process that begins with, "Is this right?" and continues with, "Do I accept this?" A process that never even starts in a mind that has been trained to remain passive. This is why, across centuries, the non-thinking individual was idealized as the perfect subject, the perfect soldier, the perfect citizen, because such a person does not argue with their conscience, does not measure the moral weight of an order, and does not interrupt the system with hesitation, but simply executes. And as long as execution continues, the system breathes easily. This is precisely why mercy becomes dangerous. Mercy interrupts motion. Mercy forces a pause. Mercy requires looking. And when someone looks, they no longer see an enemy, a target, or a category. They see a human being, and in that moment, thinking begins. Because the act of mercy pulls a person out of automatic behavior and places them into a space between command and conscience. A space history has always considered unstable, unpredictable, and therefore threatening. Mercy awakens thought, and thought weakens blind obedience. A thinking person no longer follows every order instinctively. They begin to weigh outcomes, imagine alternatives, and place themselves in the position of the other. And the moment this process starts, systems built on fear begin to crack. Fear silences, mercy awakens. Fear bends the spine, mercy straightens it. Fear says, "This is how it must be." Mercy asks, "Could it be different?" And history does not like that question. History is not built on questions. It is built on results. That is why mercy has so often been treated not as virtue, but as risk. Because mercy may save one life in the present, but it has the power to awaken many minds, and awakened minds are never easy to control. Perhaps this is the most unsettling truth of all. History did not label mercy as weakness because it misunderstood it. History labeled mercy as weakness because it understood exactly what mercy could unleash. Power has never existed on its own, and it never will, because power without reinforcement is fragile, temporary, and constantly afraid of collapsing under the weight of those it tries to rule, which is why, from the earliest days of organized societies, power searched for something deeper than weapons, deeper than armies, deeper than walls. It found fear, not fear as chaos, not fear as panic, but fear as structure. Fear as a quiet, invisible system that lives inside people long after the ruler leaves the room, long after the soldier lowers his weapon, long after the punishment is no longer happening in front of their eyes. Because true power is not measured by how often it must act, but by how rarely it needs to. And fear allows power to become efficient. Once fear is internalized, authority no longer needs to shout, explain, or justify itself, because people begin to anticipate consequences before they are spoken, adjusting their behavior not out of understanding but out of instinct, and instinct is far easier to control than reason. This is where control truly begins. Control is not created through constant violence. because constant violence is unstable, expensive, and exhausting. But through the possibility of violence, through the knowledge that disobedience will not be debated, negotiated, or understood, but punished. When people know exactly what will happen if they cross a line, they stop testing where the line is. And that certainty is priceless to power. Fear simplifies the world. It turns moral complexity into obedience. It replaces ethical struggle with survival instinct. It removes the burden of thinking and replaces it with reaction. Under fear, people do not ask why. They ask how to avoid punishment. And this is why fear became the foundation of control. Because fear does not need loyalty. It does not need belief. It does not need trust. It only needs consistency. A system built on fear does not care whether it is loved, because love is unreliable, emotional, and fragile, while fear is predictable, repeatable, and deeply rooted in human biology. Power understands this. That is why, throughout history, rulers learned to maintain distance, to avoid emotional connection, to appear untouchable, because familiarity breeds empathy, and empathy weakens authority. To control others, power must first dehumanize them, not always violently, sometimes quietly, by turning people into numbers, by turning communities into categories, by turning suffering into statistics, subjects instead of neighbors, enemies instead of humans, losses instead of lives. This reduction is not accidental, it is necessary. Once individuals disappear into abstraction, decisions become easier, orders move faster, and guilt fades into background noise, allowing systems of control to function without moral collapse. Fear supports this abstraction. Fear narrows perspective. A frightened person does not consider nuance, does not examine context, does not empathize deeply, because fear pushes the mind into survival mode, where complexity becomes a threat rather than a value. This is why fear is so useful to power. It limits thought, and thought is dangerous. Control also depends on repetition. Fear must be renewed, reinforced, and reminded, not constantly, but strategically, through examples meant to be seen rather than explained, through public punishments, humiliations, and symbolic acts that teach without words. History is full of these spectacles. Executions not meant for the condemned, but for the audience. Exiles not meant to remove one person, but to warn thousands. Acts of cruelty not driven by anger, but by demonstration. Fear spreads faster than information. Seeing someone punished teaches more effectively than hearing a rule. And this is where mercy becomes a threat, because mercy interrupts the lesson. Mercy breaks the pattern. Mercy introduces uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. When punishment is withheld, people begin to ask questions. Why was this person spared? What does this mean? Could this happen again? And the moment these questions appear, control weakens. Because control does not collapse when people rebel openly. It collapses when people begin to imagine alternatives. Fear works by convincing people that resistance is impossible, pointless, or suicidal. Mercy challenges that illusion. Mercy suggests that power can bend, that authority can hesitate, that outcomes are not fixed. And once people realize that outcomes are not fixed, obedience becomes a choice rather than a reflex. Power cannot survive long when obedience becomes a choice. This is why, in moments of crisis, wars, rebellions, economic collapse, pandemics, power always tightens control, because fear must be amplified precisely when uncertainty grows, precisely when people might begin to think for themselves. Control demands emotional hardness, a leader who feels publicly. In the ancient world, mercy was never simply a moral choice. It was a political gamble, because mercy forced rulers, commanders, and judges to see individuals instead of systems. And the moment power begins to see individuals, it begins to lose its ability to function efficiently. Ancient societies were not built to protect feelings or intentions. They were built to survive instability, scarcity, rebellion, and constant external threat. And within such conditions, mercy was not interpreted as humanity, but as vulnerability. To forgive was to invite repetition. To spare was to signal hesitation. To hesitate was to weaken authority. This logic did not arise from cruelty alone, but from fear. The fear that control, once softened, would never fully return. In early empires, law was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be clear, because clarity reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty created chaos, and chaos was the one thing ancient rulers feared more than injustice. Mercy complicated clarity. When punishment was absolute, people adapted. When consequences were predictable, obedience stabilized. But when mercy appeared, the system trembled, because mercy introduced inconsistency, and inconsistency in the ancient world was interpreted as the first step toward collapse. A merciful ruler was dangerous not because he was kind, but because he disrupted expectation. Because once people witnessed mercy, they began to ask why it was not universal, why it was selective, and whether authority was truly absolute. These questions were not philosophical luxuries in the ancient world. They were threats. This is why mercy was often punished more severely than disobedience itself. History records countless examples of rulers who spared enemies only to be overthrown, generals who hesitated only to be replaced, judges who showed compassion only to be accused of weakness, corruption, or betrayal. In ancient political culture, mercy created suspicion. If a ruler forgave an enemy, people wondered whether he feared them. If a commander spared a defeated foe, soldiers questioned whether he lacked resolve. If a king showed restraint, rivals interpreted it as opportunity. Mercy was read not as moral strength, but as strategic failure, and the ancient world was unforgiving to those who failed strategically. Empires expanded through demonstration, not dialogue. Public punishment served a function far greater than justice. It was theater, instruction, and warning, combined into a single moment meant to be remembered long after the bodies were gone. Mercy interrupted this theater. When a life was spared, the lesson dissolved. The crowd did not learn obedience. They learned possibility. And possibility is dangerous. Ancient rulers understood that fear travels faster than gratitude, that terror spreads more efficiently than loyalty, and that obedience born from fear requires less maintenance than obedience born from trust. Trust must be renewed constantly. Fear sustains itself. This is why acts of mercy were often followed by acts of correction. A merciful king would soon feel pressure to prove his strength. A forgiving general would be urged to restore discipline. A compassionate leader would be surrounded by advisors warning that softness invites rebellion. And when mercy persisted, punishment followed, not always immediately, but inevitably. Sometimes the punishment came in the form of exile, sometimes in assassination, sometimes in quiet replacement. History rarely framed these outcomes as punishment for mercy. Instead, it described them as necessity. The ancient world believed that order required sacrifice, and too often, mercy was the sacrifice demanded. There is also a deeper reason mercy was punished. Mercy humanized enemies. To rule effectively, ancient power structures required distance between ruler and ruled, between victor and defeated, between citizen and enemy. Mercy collapsed that distance. Once an enemy was spared, they were no longer an abstraction. They became a person. And once they became a person, killing them later became harder. Justifying violence became more complex, and sustaining authority required greater effort. Ancient systems did not want complexity. They wanted efficiency. They wanted obedience without reflection. They wanted order without moral debate. Mercy demanded reflection, and reflection threatened obedience. This is why mercy was tolerated only in private, never in public. A ruler could be merciful in secret, but not as policy. A commander could show kindness, but not as example. A judge could feel compassion, but not express it openly. Public mercy weakened fear, and fear was the currency of stability. The punishment of mercy, therefore, was not always explicit. Sometimes it was isolation, sometimes loss of influence, sometimes gradual erosion of authority. But the message was always the same. Kindness belongs to individuals. Power belongs to systems, and systems do not forgive what they cannot control. Perhaps the most tragic truth of the ancient world is this: mercy was not absent. It existed, but it survived only in whispers, in small gestures, in private acts history never recorded. History remembers destruction because destruction is visible. It forgets mercy because mercy is quiet. And so the ancient world did not reject mercy because it was wrong. It rejected mercy because it was dangerous. Dangerous to fear, dangerous to control, dangerous to the very structures that kept power alive. In the ancient world, mercy was not a virtue to be celebrated. It was a liability to be corrected, and often it was corrected with punishment. Rebellions in the ancient world rarely ended with understanding or reconciliation. They ended with exemplary punishment, because power did not seek to correct rebellion. It sought to erase the idea of rebellion itself. And the fastest way to erase an idea was not persuasion, but terror made visible. When a revolt failed, the punishment was never meant only for those who participated. It was designed for everyone who watched, everyone who heard, and everyone who might one day consider asking the same questions. Because an exemplary punishment teaches without dialogue and warns without explanation. Cities were destroyed not because destruction was necessary, but because memory was dangerous. Leaders were executed publicly not because justice demanded it, but because fear required witnesses. Bodies were displayed not as cruelty, but as messages. The message was always the same. This is what happens when you think resistance is possible. In this system, mercy had no place. A merciful response to rebellion did not restore order. It weakened it because forgiveness suggested that authority could be challenged and survived, that defiance did not always lead to annihilation, and that survival after rebellion was imaginable. And imagination, more than weapons, has always frightened power. This is why ancient rebellions ended not with compromise, but with spectacle, because spectacle creates certainty, and certainty sustains control. At the same time, leaders who chose mercy often met a quieter but equally ruthless fate. A ruler who spared rebels was seen as unstable. A commander who forgave defeat was seen as indecisive. A leader who valued reconciliation over punishment was seen as dangerous, not to enemies but to the system itself. Mercy did not earn loyalty from elites. It raised suspicion. Advisors whispered that leniency invited weakness. Rivals interpreted restraint as opportunity. Soldiers questioned whether discipline still mattered. And slowly, inevitably, the merciful leader lost support. Sometimes this loss came through assassination, sometimes through exile, sometimes through quiet replacement under the language of necessity. History rarely records these moments as punishment for mercy. Instead, it frames them as political realism. But the pattern is unmistakable. Rebellion was punished loudly, so fear could spread. Mercy was punished quietly, so doubt could disappear. Because doubt is more dangerous to power than open revolt. Open revolt can be crushed. Doubt spreads silently, and merciful leaders create doubt. They prove that authority can hesitate. They reveal that power can choose restraint. They remind people that systems are not machines. but decisions made by humans. And once people understand that power is a choice, they begin to believe it can be changed. This is why, across the ancient world, mercy toward rebellion was treated as betrayal, and mercy in leadership was treated as weakness, not because it failed morally, but because it succeeded psychologically. It made people think, and history has always been far more willing to forgive cruelty than to tolerate thought. Empires do not begin with cruelty. They begin with ambition, with fear of extinction, with the desire to secure borders, resources, and survival. But as they expand, as they grow larger than any single person can fully comprehend, something subtle and dangerous happens to them. Distance appears. Distance between ruler and ruled. Distance between decision and consequence. Distance between action and human cost. And where distance grows, harshness follows. An empire governs too many people to know them individually, too many lands to understand them deeply, and too many cultures to negotiate with patiently, which means it cannot rely on empathy as a governing principle, because empathy requires proximity, and empires are built on separation. To manage scale, empires simplify. They turn people into populations, regions into resources, lives into calculations. This simplification is not accidental. It is necessary for administration, for logistics, for control, but it comes at a cost. Humanity becomes inefficient. Harshness is efficient. Harshness requires fewer explanations, fewer negotiations, fewer emotional burdens. A harsh decision can be applied universally. A merciful one requires judgment, and judgment slows systems down. Empires are allergic to delay. They operate under constant pressure. Pressure to expand, pressure to defend, pressure to suppress internal dissent, pressure to maintain legitimacy in places where loyalty is thin and fragile. Under this pressure, mercy becomes a liability, because mercy is uneven. One group forgiven today creates resentment in another group punished tomorrow. One city spared invites another to test the same limits. One act of restraint invites interpretation, and interpretation threatens authority. Empires do not fear rebellion as much as they fear precedent. A single merciful act can echo far beyond its original context, creating expectations that cannot be fulfilled consistently across vast territories. And when expectations are broken, resentment grows faster than fear ever could. Harshness avoids this problem. Harshness is predictable. Everyone knows the rules. Everyone knows the cost of defiance. Everyone knows that exceptions will not be made. Predictability stabilizes empires, not justice. Predictability. This is why empires often become harsher as they grow older. In their early stages, they may experiment with tolerance, integration, even generosity, because their power is still flexible and their identity still forming. But once an empire reaches its peak, once it stretches across continents and cultures, flexibility becomes dangerous. Every concession feels like weakness. Every compromise feels like loss. Every act of mercy feels like surrender. And fear begins to drive policy. Fear of fragmentation, fear of rebellion, fear of collapse. Empires are not confident structures, they are anxious ones. The larger they grow, the more fragile they become, because their survival depends not on shared values, but on enforced order, and enforced order requires visible consequences. Harshness becomes a language understood across borders, cultures, and beliefs. Violence translates universally. Punishment needs no interpreter. Mercy does. This is why empires invest so heavily in spectacle. Public executions, mass punishments, displays of overwhelming force, not because they enjoy cruelty, but because they need to remind both subjects and elites that resistance is futile and deviation will not be tolerated. These spectacles are not emotional outbursts. They are administrative tools. Fear, once displayed, maintains itself. Another reason empires become harsh is internal competition. Empires are not monolithic. They are arenas of rival elites, generals, governors, and administrators, all competing for favor, influence, and survival. And in such environments, mercy is often interpreted as weakness by peers rather than virtue. A governor who rules gently risks appearing ineffective. A general who spares enemies risks losing prestige. A ruler who hesitates risks losing loyalty among those who benefit from strength. Harshness signals control. Control signals legitimacy. And legitimacy is everything in imperial systems. There is also a moral exhaustion that sets in. Empires fight too many wars, suppress too many revolts, and witness too much suffering to process it emotionally. So cruelty becomes normalized, not because people are inherently evil, but because constant exposure to violence dulls empathy. What begins as necessity becomes habit. What begins as defense becomes policy. Over time, harshness stops feeling extreme. It becomes routine, and routine cruelty is far more dangerous than deliberate brutality because it no longer feels like a choice. It feels inevitable. Perhaps the most tragic reason empires become harsh is this: they mistake survival for success. They confuse endurance with righteousness. As long as the empire exists, its methods are justified, and any action that preserves it becomes acceptable, no matter the human cost, because collapse is imagined as worse than cruelty. In this mindset, mercy appears irresponsible. Mercy risks destabilizing what has already been paid for in blood. And so empires harden, not all at once, not intentionally, but gradually, inevitably, until harshness feels like realism and compassion feels naive. History does not remember empires as harsh because they chose cruelty freely. It remembers them as harsh because at scale, power finds cruelty easier to sustain than humanity. And yet, this is the paradox history rarely acknowledges. The very harshness that stabilizes empires in the short term is what erodes them in the long term, because fear can hold territories together, but it cannot make them loyal. Harshness can silence dissent, but it cannot erase resentment. And eventually, what was once controlled by fear collapses under the weight of everything it suppressed. Empires become harsh to survive, but they fall because they forget how to be human. Harshness works quickly, and that speed is precisely why history keeps returning to it. Because in moments of crisis, uncertainty, or instability, power does not look for what is right, it looks for what is immediate. Fear produces instant results. A harsh order does not need to be understood. It does not need to be accepted. It does not need to be believed. It only needs to be obeyed. And obedience gained through fear is faster than obedience gained through trust, because trust must be built, tested, and renewed, while fear can be activated in a single moment. This is why harshness appears effective. It creates silence overnight. It ends resistance before it spreads. It restores order without negotiation. From the outside, this looks like strength, but it is speed, not stability. Harshness simplifies complex problems by removing human nuance. It turns moral dilemmas into commands, social tension into punishment, political disagreement into force. This simplification creates the illusion of control. When people are afraid, disorder retreats temporarily because fear compresses behavior, narrows options, and pushes individuals into survival mode, where long-term thinking disappears and immediate compliance becomes the priority. In this state, systems appear efficient, rebellions fade, protests quiet down, opposition dissolves, and power mistakes this silence for success. But fear-based success is shallow. It does not change beliefs. It does not resolve grievances. It does not eliminate resentment. It only postpones expression. Harshness forces people to comply externally while remaining unchanged internally. And this gap between outward obedience and inner resistance is where instability grows quietly. Fear freezes action, but it sharpens memory. People may submit, but they remember. They may obey, but they observe. They may remain silent, but they wait. Short-term success comes from shock. Shock overwhelms the nervous system. Shock disrupts organization. Shock prevents coordination. That is why harsh crackdowns often work at first. They disorient, but shock fades. And when it does, what remains is not loyalty, but calculation. People learn how to survive the system rather than support it. They adapt. They pretend. They comply just enough. Harshness encourages conformity, not commitment, and conformity is brittle. The moment fear weakens through economic strain, military defeat, leadership change, or external pressure, the structure built on it begins to fracture because there is nothing underneath holding it together. Fear demands constant reinforcement. It must be refreshed through new punishments, new examples, new displays of force, because old fear loses its edge, and maintaining that cycle becomes increasingly costly. Every act of harshness solves a problem today by creating a larger one tomorrow. Every suppression generates resentment. Every punishment creates memory. Every humiliation plants identity. Short-term success is achieved by sacrificing the future. History is filled with regimes that appeared strong precisely when they were most fragile, because their control depended on uninterrupted pressure, and pressure is exhausting. Harsh systems cannot relax. They cannot tolerate mistakes. They cannot allow openness. They cannot afford mercy, because mercy would expose how thin their authority really is. This is another reason harshness feels successful. It centralizes power. Fear concentrates decision-making. It silences alternatives. It removes debate. From the top, everything looks orderly. But beneath the surface, complexity has not disappeared. It has been buried. And buried complexity always returns with force. Harshness also creates dependency. People stop acting responsibly because responsibility has been replaced by obedience. They wait for orders. They avoid initiative. They avoid risk. This makes systems appear stable in the short term because nothing moves without permission. But it also makes them fragile because when unexpected challenges arise, there is no adaptability, no trust, and no internal resilience. Short-term success is achieved by reducing human beings to controllable units. Long-term success requires treating them as partners. History repeatedly chose the former because it was easier. Harshness does not require moral authority. It does not require vision. It does not require legitimacy. It only requires force, and force is always available. This is why harsh leaders often rise quickly. They cut through hesitation. They impose clarity. They promise safety through control. But what they truly offer is simplicity, and simplicity is seductive in uncertain times. The tragedy is that this simplicity is false. It masks unresolved tensions. It delays inevitable reckoning. It confuses order with health. Harshness brings short-term success because it suppresses symptoms, not causes. It treats unrest as disobedience rather than communication. It treats resistance as threat rather than signal. It treats fear as solution rather than warning. And so, history records many moments of sudden stability, dramatic consolidation, and apparent triumph, followed inevitably by collapse, fragmentation, or explosion. Because what is built quickly, without trust, without consent, and without humanity, rarely lasts. Short-term success is loud. Long-term stability is quiet. History, unfortunately, has always been better at hearing noise. Those who showed mercy did not lose because they were wrong. They lost because they were early, because they acted as individuals in systems designed to crush individuality, and because history rarely rewards those who move ahead of the structure that surrounds them. Mercy requires timing, and history is unforgiving to those who act before the world is ready. A merciful leader operates on a different rhythm than power itself, because mercy slows decisions down, forces reflection, and acknowledges human cost, while political systems, especially imperial ones, are built to move forward regardless of cost. This difference in rhythm is fatal. Power moves fast, mercy moves carefully, and history favors speed. Those who showed mercy hesitated in moments when hesitation was interpreted as weakness, not because it truly was weak, but because systems built on fear could not afford pauses, could not afford doubt, and could not afford leaders who appeared uncertain in front of those waiting to exploit uncertainty. A merciful decision creates ambiguity, and ambiguity terrifies power. When a leader spares an enemy, forgives a rebellion, or chooses restraint over punishment, they do more than save lives. They disrupt expectations, and expectation is the backbone of authority. People expect punishment, elites expect firmness, rivals expect decisiveness. Mercy breaks all three. Those who showed mercy often underestimated how deeply fear-based systems depend on consistency, because once fear becomes selective, it loses its authority, and once fear loses authority, control must be rebuilt from something else: trust, legitimacy, shared values, things empires rarely possess in abundance. Merciful leaders also suffer from a structural disadvantage. They demand moral effort not only from themselves, but from everyone around them. Advisors must think instead of enforce. Soldiers must judge instead of obey. Officials must interpret instead of execute. This creates friction, and friction slows systems down. History shows us again and again that merciful rulers were not overthrown by the masses they spared, but by the elites who feared what mercy would cost them: prestige, power, certainty, and the protection that fear-based order provided. Mercy makes violence harder to justify, and violence is how power often proves itself. A ruler who shows mercy weakens the rituals of domination that keep rivals in check, because cruelty is not only a tool against enemies, but a signal to allies that strength remains intact. When that signal fades, loyalty begins to fracture. Those who showed mercy also misunderstood how deeply obedience is tied to predictability. Fear-based systems do not require love, but they require reliability. When mercy enters the equation, outcomes become uncertain. Will punishment come? Will forgiveness return? Will rules apply equally? These questions may seem healthy, but to systems built on control, they are destabilizing. Merciful leaders often assumed that gratitude would replace fear. Sometimes it did, briefly, but gratitude is quiet. Fear is loud. Fear spreads. Fear organizes. Fear mobilizes. Gratitude rarely does. Those who showed mercy also faced a psychological burden that harsh leaders avoided. They carried the weight of every spared life, every compromise, every consequence, while ruthless leaders externalized responsibility, blaming necessity, tradition, or survival. Mercy personalizes guilt. Cruelty distributes it. And history is kinder to those who spread responsibility thinly than to those who carry it alone. There is also a deeper tragedy. Mercy humanizes conflict, and humanized conflict is harder to control. Once enemies are seen as people, wars become morally complex, punishments feel excessive, and authority begins to require justification rather than demand compliance. Merciful leaders ask their societies to mature. History rarely allows time for that. Societies shaped by fear do not transform overnight, and leaders who attempt to accelerate moral evolution often stand alone, unsupported by structures, traditions, or institutions strong enough to protect them. They become vulnerable, not because they lack strength, but because they stand exposed. History does not crush merciful leaders loudly. It erodes them quietly, through lost support, through whispered doubts, through shifting alliances, through silent replacements. And later, history explains their fall with cold language. They were naive. They were unrealistic. They did not understand power. But this explanation hides the truth. They understood power too well. They understood that power built on fear cannot be made humane without collapsing first. And they paid the price for trying. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this: those who showed mercy did not lose because mercy failed. They lost because mercy worked. It revealed cracks, it awakened thought, it destabilized systems that depended on silence. History does not forgive those who expose its foundations. It rewards those who reinforce them. And so those who showed mercy were remembered not as visionaries but as failures, not because they lacked strength, but because they challenged the very logic history was written by. Violence becomes most dangerous not when it is uncontrolled, but when it is justified. Because unjustified violence shocks the conscience, but justified violence silences it. In the ancient and medieval world, power eventually discovered that fear alone was not enough, because fear controls behavior, but it does not control belief. And belief is far more powerful than obedience, because people will endure suffering willingly if they believe it serves a higher purpose. This is where religion and ideology entered history, not as sources of violence, but as tools that transformed violence into duty. Once violence was framed as sacred, necessary, or inevitable, it stopped being questioned. Killing was no longer killing. Punishment was no longer cruelty. Conquest was no longer theft. It became righteousness. Religion offered something fear never could: moral certainty. Fear says, do this or suffer. Religion says, do this and you are good. And that difference changes everything. When violence is backed by divine will, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like obedience to something greater than oneself, something eternal, something unquestionable. And in that state, personal responsibility dissolves. The hand that strikes no longer belongs to the individual. It belongs to God, to fate, to destiny, to history itself. Ideology works in a similar way. Where religion invokes the sacred, ideology invokes the inevitable. It tells people that suffering is temporary, that violence is necessary, that cruelty is a stage on the path toward a better future. Once violence is framed as progress, resistance becomes ignorance. Those who oppose it are no longer moral dissenters. They are enemies of truth, enemies of destiny, enemies of the future. And enemies, by definition, deserve no mercy. This is the moment where mercy becomes treason. A merciful act challenges the narrative. If violence is necessary, why hesitate? If suffering is sacred, why reduce it? If the enemy is evil, why spare them? Mercy exposes contradiction, and systems built on belief cannot tolerate contradiction. Religion and ideology provided power with something priceless, a way to outsource guilt. Violence no longer required personal justification. It had already been justified. Soldiers were told they were instruments. Executioners were told they were servants. Rulers were told they were chosen, and chosen people do not question commands. This is why religious and ideological violence is often colder than personal cruelty. It is not fueled by anger, it is fueled by conviction. Conviction does not hesitate. Conviction does not empathize. Conviction does not doubt. A man acting out of hatred may stop. A man acting out of belief rarely does. History is filled with moments where entire populations accepted brutality, not because they were forced to, but because they believed it was right. burnings, purges, holy wars, revolutions, all justified, all explained, all remembered as necessity. Religion and ideology also solved a crucial problem for power. They unified violence across vast distances. Fear weakens over time and space. Belief does not. A ruler cannot personally threaten every village, but belief can travel without the ruler. A doctrine can enforce obedience where armies cannot reach. This made religion and ideology perfect companions to empire. They did not replace violence, they made it sustainable. And once violence becomes sustainable, it becomes normalized. Children grow up inside it. Rituals form around it. Language softens it. Words change. Killing becomes purification. Punishment becomes justice. Suffering becomes sacrifice. And when language changes, perception follows. Mercy in such systems becomes dangerous not because it stops violence, but because it interrupts belief. A merciful act suggests that violence might not be necessary after all. That suggestion alone is enough to destabilize entire worldviews. This is why merciful figures within religious or ideological systems were often isolated, silenced, or eliminated, not because they were immoral, but because they were inconsistent with the story. Stories matter more than truth in systems of control. Once violence is justified, it no longer feels violent. It feels clean, it feels ordered, it feels meaningful. And meaningful violence is far harder to stop than chaotic brutality. This is the darkest lesson history teaches us. People do not commit atrocities because they are evil. They commit atrocities because they are convinced. Convinced they are right. Convinced they are chosen. Convinced they are necessary. And once violence becomes moral, mercy becomes betrayal, not to the state, not to the ruler, but to the idea itself. That is why history shows us again and again that the most extreme violence emerges not in moments of lawlessness, but in moments of absolute certainty. Certainty leaves no room for mercy, because mercy requires doubt, and doubt is the enemy of belief. History is loud. It remembers flames, not candles. It remembers collapse, not restraint. It remembers destruction, not refusal. And because of this, the most merciful people who ever lived often disappear between the lines, not because they were insignificant, but because their actions did not serve the kind of memory history was built to preserve. History is written around outcomes, not intentions. It records who conquered, not who chose not to. It records who punished, not who spared. It records who ruled through fear, not who questioned whether fear should rule at all. Merciful people rarely leave monuments behind. They do not carve their decisions into stone. They do not announce their restraint with spectacle. They do not build empires that demand to be remembered. They act quietly, often in moments where violence would have been easier, faster, and more visible. They choose pause instead of reaction, restraint instead of domination, and understanding instead of certainty. And because nothing dramatic follows, history turns the page. The merciful individual does not reshape borders. They reshape moments. And moments are fragile things. They vanish unless someone decides they matter. History rarely does. Merciful people also tend to work against momentum. While the world moves toward escalation, they slow it down. While systems demand obedience, they question necessity. While crowds demand punishment, they ask for proportion. This resistance to momentum makes mercy difficult to narrate. There is no clear climax, no decisive victory, no undeniable proof of success, only absence. The absence of blood, the absence of retaliation, the absence of spectacle. And absence does not photograph well. History prefers clarity. It prefers beginnings and endings, victories and defeats, heroes and villains, because complexity weakens storytelling, and mercy is deeply complex. Mercy requires context. It requires intention. It requires understanding consequences that never happened. How do you record the war that did not occur? The execution that was canceled, the city that was spared? You cannot show what never took place, and so mercy dissolves into silence. Another reason merciful people vanish from history is that their actions often contradict the dominant narratives of their time. If history is being written to justify power, mercy is inconvenient. If history is being written to explain violence, mercy raises doubt. If history is being written to glorify conquest, mercy disrupts the myth. Narratives protect themselves. They exclude what challenges them, and merciful individuals challenge the core assumption that suffering was necessary. That assumption is too heavy to question easily. Mercy also tends to be personal rather than institutional. Systems rarely act mercifully. Individuals do, and individuals are vulnerable. They are erased by replacement, by exile, by quiet removal, and later their absence is explained as irrelevance rather than silencing. History does not say they were removed because they refused cruelty. It says they failed. Failure is easier to accept than moral challenge. Perhaps the most tragic truth is that merciful people often succeed in the only way history does not measure. They reduce suffering. They preserve dignity. They protect life. But none of these outcomes guarantee power, longevity, or legacy. A merciful act may save a generation, but it rarely builds a dynasty. And history is obsessed with dynasties. Merciful people also tend to resist certainty. They are uncomfortable with absolute answers, rigid ideologies, and total solutions, because mercy requires acknowledging that every situation contains nuance, and nuance is slow. History moves quickly. It cannot wait for nuance, and so merciful people fall behind the march of events, not because they are weak, but because they refuse to simplify humanity for the sake of speed. There is a quiet cruelty in this silence, because when history forgets merciful people, it teaches future generations that restraint does not matter, that kindness does not endure, and that power alone shapes the world. But this lesson is incomplete. History does not remember mercy because mercy does not seek remembrance. It seeks relief. It seeks survival. It seeks to prevent what would otherwise be inevitable. And perhaps this is the final irony. The merciful people history remained silent about may have done more to preserve humanity than those history never stopped praising. They did not win. They did not rule. They did not conquer. But they prevented the world from becoming even worse than it already was. And silence, in this case, is not proof of failure. It is proof that mercy did not need an audience to exist. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled himself. First, Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire of his time. Yet what defined him was not conquest, spectacle, or terror, but an unusual and often dangerous choice: the decision to govern himself before governing others. Unlike many rulers before and after him, Marcus Aurelius did not believe that power granted moral superiority. Instead, he believed that power exposed moral weakness, and that the higher one rose, the greater the responsibility to restrain one's impulses, fears, and desire for domination. He commanded armies, suppressed rebellions, and defended Rome's borders, but he did so without celebrating violence, without glorifying cruelty, and without presenting force as virtue. Because for him, power was not a right to act freely, but a burden that demanded constant self-control. In his private writings, never meant for an audience, never written to justify rule, Marcus repeatedly warned himself against anger, arrogance, and the illusion that authority made him better than those he governed. reminding himself that emperors and slaves shared the same fragile human condition. This inward focus made him unusual and in many ways vulnerable. He did not rule through fear theatrically. He did not seek loyalty through spectacle. He did not build his legacy on terror. Instead, he tried to govern through discipline, duty, and restraint, believing that order achieved without excess cruelty was stronger than order enforced by constant brutality. But history is rarely kind to such restraint. Marcus Aurelius did not expand the empire dramatically. He did not end Rome's internal decay. He did not prevent the long decline that followed. His mercy did not save Rome. And this is the uncomfortable truth history often avoids. His philosophical strength made him admirable as a human being, but ineffective as a symbol of imperial dominance, because empires reward force that expands outward, not discipline that turns inward. Marcus Aurelius stands as a paradox. He proved that a ruler could be thoughtful, self-critical, and morally aware, yet his example also revealed the limits of mercy within imperial systems, because while he governed himself with care, the empire itself demanded harshness, expansion, and suppression to survive. In the end, Marcus Aurelius is remembered not as Rome's greatest conqueror, but as its most human emperor. And perhaps that is why history speaks of him softly, because his legacy does not fit the pattern history prefers. He reminds us that moral clarity does not guarantee political success, that self-mastery does not stop systemic decay, and that mercy, even when practiced by the most powerful man on earth, cannot easily reshape structures built on fear. Marcus Aurelius did not lose because he was weak. He lost because he tried to be good inside a system that did not reward goodness. And that may be the quietest tragedy of all. Ashoka, the emperor who regretted victory. Ashoka began his reign like many rulers of the ancient world. Ambitious, expansionist, and convinced that strength was proven through conquest, not restraint, and that authority was secured by fear rather than reflection. His greatest victory came through war. The conquest of Kalinga was decisive, brutal, and absolute. Cities fell, armies collapsed, civilians suffered. By the standards of history, it was a success. But Ashoka stood among the ruins and did something history almost never records. He looked. He looked not at maps or borders, but at bodies, at grieving families, at the human cost that victory usually hides behind celebration. And in that moment, something rare occurred. The conqueror felt remorse, not strategic regret, not political calculation, but moral shock. Ashoka realized that nothing had been gained that justified what had been lost, and that power achieved through suffering did not strengthen the ruler. It hollowed him. This realization did not make him weak. It made him dangerous to the logic of empire. Instead of continuing expansion, Ashoka chose restraint. Instead of glorifying violence, he condemned it. Instead of ruling through terror, he sought moral authority. He embraced nonviolence, tolerance, and ethical governance not as slogans but as policy, attempting to transform an empire built on conquest into one guided by responsibility. And this is where Ashoka's story becomes deeply uncomfortable for history, because history does not know what to do with a ruler who regrets victory. Ashoka did not erase violence from his empire. He did not undo the suffering he had caused, but he refused to repeat it. He governed through persuasion rather than fear, through law rather than spectacle, through example rather than terror, believing that power justified by ethics was stronger than power enforced by cruelty. Yet this transformation did not produce dramatic expansion. It did not create new legends of conquest. It did not satisfy history's appetite for dominance. Ashoka's reign became quieter, and quiet power rarely captures historical imagination. To many later chroniclers, Ashoka appeared as an anomaly, a ruler who turned away from the very methods that had made him great, a conqueror who questioned conquest itself. His remorse was interpreted not as wisdom, but as withdrawal, not as strength, but as softness. And yet, Ashoka's choice revealed a truth history struggles to accept. Victory does not always mean correctness. Success does not always mean justification. Ashoka understood that ruling without violence required far more discipline than ruling through fear, because fear silences opposition quickly, but ethical rule demands constant effort, patience, and vulnerability. He chose the harder path, and history rarely rewards those who choose difficulty over dominance. Ashoka did not lose his throne because of mercy, but he lost something else, the kind of fame history reserves for conquerors. He became remembered not for what he destroyed, but for what he refused to destroy next. And that may be the most radical act of all. Ashoka stands as a reminder that power can recognize its own brutality, but recognition alone does not rewrite history's rules, because while humanity may admire repentance, history still celebrates momentum. He did not regret defeat. He regretted victory, and that regret placed him forever at the margins of history's loudest stories, not because he failed, but because he refused to continue succeeding the way history expected him to. Saladin, mercy toward enemies. Saladin rose in an age that rewarded brutality, spectacle, and absolute domination, an age where mercy toward enemies was not interpreted as virtue, but as vulnerability, and where restraint was often punished more harshly than violence itself. He was a warrior, a commander, and a ruler shaped by constant war, yet what made Saladin historically uncomfortable was not his military skill, but the way he treated those he defeated, because instead of erasing enemies to prove strength, he chose to limit destruction even when destruction was expected. His most defining moment came not during battle, but after victory. When Jerusalem fell, history anticipated massacre. The city had been taken before, and it had bled before. Revenge was assumed. Retribution was expected. The logic of the time was clear. A conquered city must suffer because suffering demonstrated dominance, erased resistance, and warned others not to challenge power again. Saladin broke that logic. He allowed civilians to leave. He spared lives. He protected holy sites. And in doing so, he committed an act far more radical than conquest. He denied history its favorite ending. This mercy was not weakness. It was discipline. Saladin understood something many rulers never did, that cruelty creates fear, but fear creates enemies that never forget, while mercy, though risky, can disarm hatred even when it does not erase conflict. Yet history struggled with this choice. Saladin's mercy did not end the Crusades. It did not stop future wars. It did not convert enemies into allies overnight. What it did was far subtler. It exposed an alternative where power did not need to announce itself through blood, where victory did not require humiliation, and where authority could exist without total annihilation of the defeated. This alternative was dangerous, not to enemies but to expectations, because when a ruler spares those he could destroy, he reveals that violence is not inevitable. And once violence is shown to be optional, every future act of brutality demands justification rather than obedience. Saladin's mercy forced comparison. Enemies who survived him began to judge other rulers by his example. Chroniclers were forced to reconcile admiration with opposition. Warriors trained for hatred found themselves facing restraint. This created a paradox. Saladin was respected by enemies, yet that respect did not translate into historical dominance, because history does not reward those who complicate narratives. It prefers villains and heroes, not restraint within conflict. Saladin's mercy also placed limits on his own power. By choosing restraint, he accepted that some advantages would be lost, that fear would be weaker, that intimidation would be incomplete, that control would require constant effort rather than instant terror. He governed not through spectacle, but through consistency. This demanded discipline not only from him, but from his followers, because mercy must be enforced as firmly as cruelty, or it collapses into chaos. And enforcing mercy is harder than enforcing fear. Fear spreads naturally. Mercy requires structure. Saladin's rule therefore carried a constant tension, maintaining authority while refusing excess, preserving order while resisting brutality, fighting wars while attempting not to become defined by them. History rarely appreciates this tension. It sees outcomes, not balance. Saladin did not build an empire remembered for eternal dominance. He did not create a system that outlived conflict itself. What he created instead was a standard, a moment where enemies paused to acknowledge humanity in warfare, even if they later returned to violence. And that pause matters more than history admits. Saladin's mercy did not change the world, but it changed how the world remembered him. And that memory is fragile, because it does not fit comfortably into narratives of conquest or collapse. He stands neither as a saint nor as a tyrant, but as a ruler who understood the cost of cruelty and chose restraint in a system that rewarded excess. Saladin reminds us that mercy in war does not end war. It ends certainty. It challenges the belief that violence must always escalate, that victory must always humiliate, and that power must always crush. History does not know how to celebrate such figures. They win battles, but not myths. They command armies, but not narratives. They shape moments, but not epics. And yet, Saladin's mercy toward enemies lingers precisely because it was unnecessary, unexpected, and unprofitable in the short term. He could have destroyed. He chose not to. And that choice remains one of the quietest, most unsettling acts in the history of power. Cyrus the Great. Tolerance as imperial strategy. Cyrus the Great did not build his empire through fear alone. And this single fact places him in quiet opposition to most rulers. History chooses to celebrate because Cyrus understood something profoundly unsettling to the logic of domination, that cruelty secures obedience, but tolerance secures endurance. In an ancient world where conquest usually meant erasure of gods, customs, languages, and memory, Cyrus chose a different path, not because he lacked power, but because he understood power too well to waste it on endless repression. He conquered widely. He ruled over diverse peoples. He commanded immense military strength. Yet instead of enforcing uniformity, he permitted difference. Religions were allowed to continue. Local laws were respected. Cultural identities were preserved rather than crushed. This was not sentimental mercy. It was strategic restraint. Cyrus recognized that empires collapse not from external attack alone, but from internal exhaustion, because ruling through constant fear requires constant violence, and constant violence drains resources, loyalty, and legitimacy faster than conquest ever expands them. Tolerance, by contrast, reduces resistance before it forms. When people are allowed to remain themselves, they resist less. When belief is not threatened, rebellion loses urgency. When identity is respected, loyalty becomes possible. Cyrus did not demand love. He reduced hatred, and reducing hatred is often more effective than inspiring devotion. This approach confused both enemies and later historians, because it disrupted the expected pattern of imperial behavior, where conquered populations were meant to be humiliated to demonstrate supremacy. Cyrus understood that humiliation creates memory, and memory fuels revolt. Tolerance dissolves memory of violence. A population that survives intact does not need revenge. Yet this strategy carried risk. Tolerance requires trust. Trust in systems rather than terror. Trust in administration rather than intimidation. Trust that diversity would not weaken unity. Most empires lacked this confidence. Cyrus possessed it. He governed not by erasing difference, but by managing it, constructing an empire that functioned less like a single identity and more like a framework capable of holding many identities at once. History struggles with this model. It prefers clear domination, clear enemies, clear submission. Tolerance blurs these lines. When people are not crushed, it becomes harder to dramatize victory. When cities are spared, conquest looks less glorious. When diversity survives, empire appears less absolute. Cyrus's greatness therefore resists spectacle. There were no grand narratives of annihilation, no legendary massacres to symbolize power, no terror to echo across generations. Instead, there was administration, order, stability, continuity. And continuity does not excite history. History favors disruption over maintenance. Yet Cyrus's empire endured longer and more stably than many built on terror, precisely because tolerance reduced the need for constant enforcement, allowing power to operate quietly rather than violently. Still, tolerance has limits. Cyrus's strategy worked because it was enforced by strength. Tolerance without authority becomes chaos. Authority without tolerance becomes rebellion. Cyrus balanced both, but balance is fragile. After him, successors misunderstood the lesson. Some believed tolerance alone was enough. Others believed fear alone would suffice. Both interpretations failed. History did not remember Cyrus primarily as a philosopher king, but as a conqueror, because history cannot easily categorize a ruler who expanded through restraint, whose mercy was practical rather than moralized, and whose legacy lay in stability rather than spectacle. And yet, Cyrus reveals a truth history rarely admits. Empires do not need to be cruel to be powerful. They become cruel when they lack imagination. Tolerance, when wielded deliberately, is not weakness, it is foresight. It anticipates collapse before collapse announces itself. It prevents rebellion before rebellion becomes inevitable. It treats diversity as resource rather than threat. Cyrus did not abandon power for kindness. He refined power through restraint. And this refinement allowed his empire to breathe where others suffocated under their own brutality. History often celebrates those who conquer loudly. Cyrus conquered quietly, and because of that, his legacy feels distant, almost abstract, despite its immense influence, because tolerance does not demand remembrance, and stability leaves fewer scars to trace. But perhaps that is the point. Cyrus the Great did not prove that mercy wins hearts. He proved something far more unsettling, that tolerance, when used wisely, can hold an empire together longer than fear ever could. Socrates, the mercy of questioning. Socrates did not command armies, did not rule cities, and did not conquer lands. Yet history treated him as if he were dangerous enough to be silenced, because Socrates practiced a form of mercy that power has always feared more than rebellion, the mercy of questioning. He did not seek to destroy the system violently. He did not call for revolution. He did not organize resistance. He simply asked people to think. And thinking, in societies built on tradition, hierarchy, and unquestioned authority, is never neutral. Socrates believed that ignorance was not a crime, but pretending to know what one does not know was. And this belief placed him in direct opposition to systems that depended on certainty, reputation, and inherited truth. He did not accuse. He did not condemn. He invited conversation. This invitation was his mercy. Instead of humiliating others publicly, he exposed ideas gently, patiently, step by step, allowing people to reach contradiction themselves rather than forcing it upon them, because for Socrates, Intellectual violence was as destructive as physical violence, but this restraint made him dangerous. Power can tolerate anger, it can tolerate rebellion, it can even tolerate violence. What it cannot tolerate is doubt that spreads quietly. Socrates questioned generals about courage, politicians about justice, poets about wisdom, and priests about piety, not to overthrow them, but to understand them. And in doing so, he revealed something deeply unsettling. That authority often rested not on knowledge, but on confidence. This revelation threatened the foundations of social order. If those who claim wisdom cannot define it, if those who claim virtue cannot explain it, if those who claim authority cannot justify it, then obedience loses its moral certainty. Socrates did not attack individuals. He humanized them. He treated even his opponents as thinkers capable of error rather than enemies to be destroyed. And this refusal to dehumanize, this insistence on dialogue rather than domination, undermined the very logic that allowed societies to punish without reflection. His mercy lay in his refusal to simplify. Where power demanded slogans, he demanded definitions. Where tradition demanded acceptance, he demanded understanding. Where certainty demanded silence, he demanded questions. This form of mercy had consequences. Athens did not execute Socrates because he was violent. They executed him because he destabilized confidence. They accused him of corrupting the youth, but what he truly corrupted was complacency. Because young people exposed to questioning begin to see authority as conditional rather than absolute. And conditional authority terrifies systems built on obedience. Socrates could have escaped. He was given the chance. And this is where his mercy becomes even more radical. He refused, not because he feared death, but because he believed that breaking the law to save himself would validate the very injustice he had spent his life exposing. He chose to die rather than abandon the principle that laws must be examined, challenged, and improved from within, rather than destroyed by convenience. This choice confuses history. He did not fight. He did not flee. He did not compromise. He accepted punishment without hatred, and in doing so, he exposed the final contradiction of power, that a system confident in its justice does not need to kill a man for asking questions. Socrates' death did not protect Athens. It revealed its fear. History often frames Socrates as a martyr for philosophy, but this framing misses something essential. He was punished not for rebellion, but for mercy, for believing that dialogue was more human than force, and that truth emerged through humility rather than domination. His mercy did not save him. It did not save Athens, but it changed how future generations understood power. Socrates showed that violence is not the only threat to authority. Understanding is, and that is why he stands among the merciful figures history struggled to record. Not because his actions were small, but because they were incompatible with the logic of control. He did not overthrow the state. He exposed its insecurity. He did not destroy tradition. He asked whether tradition deserved obedience, and history answered him with poison. Yet his questions survived. And perhaps this is the final irony. Socrates lost his life because he believed people were capable of thinking together without fear. History punished him for that belief. But humanity has never stopped returning to his questions, not because they are comfortable, but because they are merciful. Akbar the Great, tolerance as a dangerous form of power. Akbar the Great ruled one of the most powerful empires of his age, yet what truly separated him from the long line of conquerors before and after him was not the scale of his territory, but the scale of his restraint, because Akbar understood that ruling a diverse empire through fear alone would eventually destroy the very structure he was trying to preserve. He inherited a world fractured by religion, ethnicity, and memory of conquest, a world where rulers were expected to impose unity through force, erase difference to ensure loyalty, and silence belief to prevent rebellion. Yet Akbar chose a path that directly contradicted this logic. He chose tolerance, not as sentiment, not as weakness, but as governance. Akbar ruled over Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Christians, Zoroastrians, and countless local traditions, and instead of demanding conformity, he allowed diversity to exist within imperial order, understanding that belief cannot be crushed without consequence, and that repression creates loyalty only on the surface while breeding resentment underneath. This decision was radical. In an age where rulers derived legitimacy from divine alignment with a single faith, Akbar questioned the idea that truth could be monopolized, and in doing so he destabilized one of the strongest pillars of traditional authority. He abolished discriminatory taxes imposed on non-believers. He appointed officials based on ability rather than religion. He encouraged open debate between scholars of different faiths. These were not symbolic gestures, they were structural risks. Akbar understood that tolerance creates uncertainty among elites, because when belief is no longer enforced, power must rely on competence, fairness, and consistency rather than intimidation, and this demands a far higher level of discipline from leadership. Tolerance does not silence opposition, it absorbs it. And absorption is far more difficult than suppression. By allowing people to remain themselves, Akbar reduced the urgency of rebellion, because rebellion thrives on existential threat, and when identity is no longer under attack, resistance loses its moral fuel. This was Akbar's strategic insight. Fear controls bodies, tolerance calms minds, but history rarely celebrates calm. Akbar's approach confused contemporaries and later chroniclers alike because it refused to fit neatly into the narrative of domination, where rulers are remembered for what they destroyed rather than what they refused to destroy. His empire expanded, but not through terror alone. His authority endured, but not through constant punishment. His legitimacy rested on stability rather than spectacle. Yet this stability came at a cost. Akbar's tolerance unsettled religious authorities who thrived on certainty. It alarmed nobles who relied on rigid hierarchy. It worried generals who believed fear was the only language soldiers understood. Tolerance made power negotiable, and negotiable power feels unsafe to those accustomed to absolutes. Akbar was often accused quietly and openly of weakening tradition, of diluting faith, of undermining order, because mercy and tolerance always appear threatening to systems built on exclusion. But Akbar did not abandon authority. He enforced law firmly. He suppressed rebellion when necessary. He defended borders decisively. His mercy was not softness, it was selectivity. Akbar understood that restraint must be paired with strength, because tolerance without authority collapses into chaos, while authority without tolerance hardens into tyranny. He attempted to balance both. History does not like balance, it prefers extremes. Akbar's legacy therefore occupies an uncomfortable space. He was too powerful to be dismissed as naive, yet too tolerant to be glorified as ruthless, and so history often reduces him to administrative achievement while ignoring the philosophical courage required to rule without religious coercion in a deeply divided world. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Akbar's reign is this: his tolerance worked. His empire remained stable across vast diversity. Rebellions were fewer than expected. Administration functioned across cultures, but success through tolerance does not create dramatic collapse or triumph. It creates continuity, and continuity rarely excites history. Akbar demonstrated that mercy and tolerance can be tools of power rather than obstacles to it. But he also exposed a painful truth: that tolerance demands constant vigilance, moral effort, and personal authority, while fear governs itself. After Akbar, many successors misunderstood his lesson. Some abandoned tolerance entirely. Others imitated its surface without its discipline, and the empire suffered. This is perhaps Akbar's final tragedy. He proved that power could rule without cruelty, but he could not ensure that future rulers would accept the burden that such power requires, because tolerance is harder than oppression, and restraint is heavier than violence. Akbar the Great did not fail. He succeeded in a way history struggles to measure. He ruled an empire without demanding that everyone become the same. He governed difference instead of destroying it. And in doing so, he revealed that mercy, when practiced deliberately, is not the opposite of strength. It is its most demanding form. William Penn, mercy without an empire. William Penn did not rule an empire, command vast armies, or conquer lands through bloodshed, and this is precisely why history often treats him as a footnote rather than a lesson, because his experiment challenged one of history's most deeply rooted assumptions, that order requires force. Penn believed something radically simple for his time, that peace was not the absence of power, but a different way of using it. When he founded Pennsylvania, he inherited a world shaped by conquest, colonization, and religious violence, a world where land was taken through intimidation, treaties were broken when convenient, and indigenous peoples were treated as obstacles rather than humans. Penn rejected this model, not rhetorically, practically. Instead of seizing land, he negotiated for it. Instead of imposing authority through weapons, he relied on agreement. Instead of ruling through fear, he insisted on consent. This approach was not naive idealism. It was deliberate moral resistance. Penn believed that violence poisoned governance at its root, because once a society accepts injustice at its foundation, every structure built on top of it becomes unstable, no matter how powerful it appears. He insisted on treaties with Native American tribes, treaties based on mutual recognition rather than coercion, and unlike many agreements of the era, these were honored not because Penn had overwhelming military power, but because he treated trust as something to be protected rather than exploited. This alone made him anomalous. In a colonial world driven by extraction and domination, Penn's refusal to use violence was interpreted as weakness, and many contemporaries predicted that his colony would collapse, be overrun, or descend into chaos. It did not. For decades, Pennsylvania remained relatively peaceful, not because conflict was impossible, but because Penn removed the conditions that made conflict inevitable: humiliation, betrayal, and erasure. Penn's mercy was structural. He did not merely forgive individuals. He designed systems that reduced the need for forgiveness. He understood that violence creates cycles while fairness interrupts them, and that once a population believes agreements will be honored, it stops preparing for betrayal. But history was uninterested. There were no great battles to record, no massacres to dramatize, no heroic last stands. Penn's success produced stability, and stability produces silence, and silence does not become legend. Penn also paid a personal price for mercy. He lost wealth. He lost political influence. He spent years imprisoned for his beliefs. He died financially ruined. Mercy did not protect him. It isolated him, because systems built on exploitation do not tolerate examples that expose alternatives, and Penn's colony proved something deeply threatening: that violence was not inevitable. This made him dangerous, not because he rebelled, but because he demonstrated restraint. Penn's vision also faced a tragic limitation. His model depended on integrity. It required leaders who valued justice over profit, and once those leaders were replaced, once the colony grew beyond his influence, the agreements he built were ignored. The trust he cultivated eroded, and violence returned. History framed this as inevitability, but inevitability is often just abandonment. Penn did not fail because his ideas were wrong. They failed because they were not maintained. This is the quiet tragedy of mercy-based systems. They require continuous moral effort, while violent systems sustain themselves automatically through fear. Penn showed that peace is not passive, it is labor. It must be defended not with weapons, but with consistency. William Penn did not change history's direction. He changed history's options. He proved that societies do not need to begin in violence, that governance without terror is possible, and that trust can function as a foundation, even if only briefly. History does not celebrate him as a conqueror. It remembers him reluctantly as an experiment, but experiments matter because they show what could have been. And perhaps that is why history speaks so softly of William Penn. Not because he was insignificant, but because his mercy exposed how unnecessary cruelty had always been. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who ended an empire without blood. Mikhail Gorbachev inherited one of the most powerful and feared political systems in human history, a system held together not by consent, but by pressure, surveillance, and the unspoken certainty that resistance would be crushed. And by the time he rose to power, that certainty was the only thing still keeping the structure intact. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was exhausted, economically strained, morally hollow, psychologically dependent on fear. Gorbachev saw this exhaustion clearly, and unlike most leaders before him, he did not interpret it as a signal to tighten control. He interpreted it as a warning. History expected a familiar response: crackdowns, force, suppression. This was the path followed repeatedly throughout the 20th century, and it worked temporarily because fear can stabilize a system long enough to postpone collapse. Gorbachev refused that path, not because he lacked the power to enforce it, but because he understood what enforcing it would cost, not only in lives, but in legitimacy and moral debt and in the future itself. He chose openness instead of silence, reform instead of repression, dialogue instead of tanks. Perestroika and glasnost were not acts of political genius alone. They were acts of restraint. By allowing criticism, admitting failure, and reducing coercion, Gorbachev dismantled the mechanisms that had protected Soviet authority for decades, fully aware that once fear loosens its grip, power cannot simply reassert itself without irreversible damage. This awareness is what makes his choice extraordinary. He understood that violence could preserve the system, and he chose not to use it. When satellite states demanded autonomy, when borders trembled, when the old order began to fracture visibly, Gorbachev stood at the exact point where history usually turns brutal. Tanks had been used before, orders had been given before, blood had flowed before. This time, it did not. Not because violence was impossible, but because it was refused. This refusal came at immense personal cost. Gorbachev was condemned by hardliners as weak, by nationalists as a traitor, by former allies as naive. He lost power, he lost status, he lost the system that had shaped his life. And yet, he prevented something far worse. The end of the Soviet Union could have been catastrophic. Civil war, mass repression, international conflict. Instead, it was largely bloodless. History struggles with this outcome. It prefers decisive victories and dramatic collapses. It understands revolution better than restraint. So Gorbachev is often remembered as the man who lost an empire, rarely as the man who refused to kill to save one. This framing reveals history's bias. History measures success by survival of systems. Humanity measures success by survival of people. Gorbachev chose the latter. His mercy was not sentimental. It was conscious. He accepted that preserving human life mattered more than preserving political power. That legitimacy gained through violence was no legitimacy at all, and that forcing unity through fear would poison whatever future remained. In doing so, he violated the oldest rule of power. That authority must never appear to choose restraint over dominance, and history punished him for it. He lived to see his legacy debated, minimized, and attacked. He became a symbol of loss rather than prevention. Yet prevention is the hardest thing to record. How do you measure the wars that did not happen, the massacres that never occurred, the cities that were never shelled? History does not record absence. Humanity survives inside it. Mikhail Gorbachev did not collapse an empire by accident. He allowed it to end without blood. And that distinction matters more than history admits. He stands among the rare figures who chose mercy at the precise moment when cruelty would have been easier, safer, and more historically familiar. He did not conquer, he did not dominate, he did not preserve power, he preserved life. And perhaps that is why history remains uncomfortable with him, because he proves that restraint, even at the highest level of power, is possible. And that the true cost of mercy is often not failure, but solitude. Jesus of Nazareth, mercy without power. Jesus of Nazareth did not command armies, did not hold political office, and did not control territory. Yet his presence unsettled one of the most powerful imperial systems in history, not because he threatened it with violence, but because he undermined its moral logic at the most fundamental level. He lived under occupation, he spoke to the powerless, he refused force, and in doing so, he challenged an assumption so deeply embedded in history that it rarely gets questioned: that change requires domination. Jesus offered a form of mercy that was not conditional, not strategic, and not enforced by authority. He did not say, "Be merciful when it is safe." He did not say, "Forgive when it benefits you." He said, "Forgive even when it costs you everything." This was not a political program, it was a moral provocation. Jesus' mercy did not aim to overthrow Rome. It aimed to dismantle the cycle of violence that made Rome possible. He spoke of loving enemies, turning the other cheek, and refusing retaliation, not because retaliation was ineffective, but because it perpetuated the very structure that kept oppression alive. Violence demands response. Mercy interrupts response, and interruption is destabilizing. For power, this was intolerable. Empires understand rebellion. They know how to crush resistance. But Jesus did not resist in ways power could recognize. He did not mobilize armies. He did not incite riots. He did not call for revenge. He refused the language of force entirely. This refusal exposed something deeply uncomfortable: that domination relies not only on weapons, but on participation, on the internal acceptance that violence is the final answer. Jesus denied that acceptance. His mercy humanized everyone: the poor, the outcast, the enemy. He collapsed the hierarchy that violence depends on, because violence requires distance, and mercy closes distance, insisting that every person retains dignity regardless of status, guilt, or power. This was not weakness. It was radical equality, and radical equality is dangerous. Jesus' mercy also stripped violence of its moral justification. If forgiveness is possible, then punishment is no longer inevitable. If compassion is required, then cruelty becomes a choice rather than necessity. And if cruelty is a choice, then those who wield it become morally accountable. This accountability threatened both religious authorities and imperial order, not because Jesus called them evil, but because he called them unnecessary. His execution was not the result of failed mercy, it was the confirmation of its threat. Crucifixion was a public message, a reminder that power ultimately belongs to those willing to use force. History interprets this moment as defeat, but history measures only outcomes it can see. Jesus' mercy did not save him. It was never meant to. It exposed the cost of refusing violence in a violent world. and that cost was death. Yet something extraordinary followed. His refusal to retaliate did not end his influence, it amplified it. Because mercy without power does something power cannot. It survives its own destruction. Empires collapse when leaders fall. Mercy spreads when martyrs die. This is the paradox history struggles to contain. Jesus did not change the system. He changed the conscience of those living inside it. And conscience is far harder to govern than territory. History eventually absorbed his message into institutions, doctrines, and states, often stripping it of its radical edge. But the original provocation remains intact, that violence is not destiny, that power is not permission, that mercy is not weakness. Jesus stands among the merciful figures history could not silence, not because he succeeded politically, but because his failure revealed something deeper, that the most transformative force in history is not domination, but refusal. Refusal to hate, refusal to retaliate, refusal to become what one opposes. History remembers conquerors because they reshape the world quickly. Humanity remembers figures like Jesus because they reshape how people see one another. And this difference explains everything. Jesus of Nazareth did not win. He was executed, but he revealed a truth history still resists, that mercy does not need power to endure. It only needs people willing to carry it forward. Nelson Mandela, mercy after power. Nelson Mandela emerged from one of the most brutal systems of modern history, not as a conqueror demanding repayment, but as a man who understood that victory achieved through humiliation would poison the future before it could begin. He spent decades imprisoned under apartheid, a system designed not only to dominate bodies but to break dignity. And when he finally walked free, history expected a familiar script: retribution, purges, revenge. This expectation was reasonable. Mandela had every justification history usually accepts. He had suffered. His people had suffered. The system that oppressed them deserved to be dismantled publicly and violently. And yet, Mandela refused to turn suffering into policy, not because he forgot injustice, but because he understood its mechanics. He knew that violence could remove rulers, but not resentment. He knew that replacing one hierarchy with another would not create freedom, only reversal, and that fear-based control, no matter who wielded it, always demanded future violence to maintain itself. Mandela chose reconciliation not as forgiveness without memory, but as strategy grounded in realism. He understood that South Africa could not survive another civil war disguised as justice. The country was fractured along racial, economic, and psychological lines so deep that any attempt at total domination would shatter it permanently. Mercy in this context was not moral display, it was survival. Mandela's approach stripped violence of its inevitability. Instead of collective punishment, he pursued shared accountability. Instead of erasing the past, he exposed it publicly. Instead of demanding submission, he demanded acknowledgement. The truth and reconciliation process was not about absolution. It was about interruption, interrupting the cycle where grievance justifies cruelty, where memory demands revenge, where power must always prove itself through force. This approach enraged extremists on all sides. To some, Mandela was too soft. To others, too threatening. Mercy satisfied no one who wanted certainty. And certainty is what violence offers. Mandela refused certainty. He accepted instability in the short term to prevent catastrophe in the long term, knowing that restraint would be interpreted as weakness, that reconciliation would be framed as betrayal, and that his legacy would be contested from the moment it began. History often simplifies Mandela into a symbol, a smiling icon, a moral victory. But this simplification hides the cost of his choice. Mercy isolated him politically. It limited his options. It required constant negotiation rather than decisive action. It forced him to absorb anger rather than redirect it. This is the hidden labor of mercy. Violence releases pressure outward. Mercy absorbs it inward. Mandela bore that pressure consciously. He did not deny the need for justice. He reframed it. Justice without dignity is vengeance. Justice without reconciliation is unfinished. And unfinished justice becomes inherited conflict. Mandela understood that nations do not heal by forgetting, nor by punishing endlessly, but by transforming memory into responsibility. This transformation did not erase inequality. It did not solve economic injustice. It did not end suffering, but it prevented mass bloodshed. And history struggles to value prevention. There were no triumphant battle scenes, no dramatic collapses broadcast in flame, only a fragile transition held together by restraint. Mandela's mercy did not make him powerful. It made him vulnerable. Because once a leader renounces violence, he must rely on persuasion, patience, and trust, tools far slower and less reliable than fear. Mandela accepted this risk. He accepted that he might be remembered as insufficient rather than ruthless. And history continues to debate him through that lens. But humanity remembers something else. That after unimaginable injustice, someone chose not to replicate the logic of oppression. That after power finally became available, someone refused to use it the way history expected. Nelson Mandela did not prove that mercy guarantees success. He proved something far more difficult, that mercy can coexist with power, but only if the one who holds power is willing to sacrifice certainty, dominance, and personal vindication. History often rewards those who break systems loudly. Mandela changed one by refusing to break people. And that refusal remains one of the rarest acts of leadership history has ever witnessed. History often feels like a long record of inevitability, as if everything that happened had to happen, as if violence was unavoidable, as if cruelty was the price of progress. But this feeling is an illusion. History is not a force of nature. It is a collection of choices made by people under pressure with alternatives they chose not to take. Throughout this journey, we have seen a pattern repeat itself again and again. When power is threatened, it tightens. When fear spreads, violence follows. When control is challenged, mercy is dismissed as weakness. And yet, scattered across centuries, across cultures, across systems that rewarded brutality, we find something unexpected. People who paused, people who restrained themselves when revenge was justified. People who chose mercy not because it was easy, but because they understood what violence would cost tomorrow. They did not always succeed. They did not always win. They were often punished, sidelined, forgotten, or misunderstood. History rarely builds monuments for them, because mercy does not leave ruins behind. It leaves lives intact, and intact lives do not shout. History is loud. It celebrates collapse, conquest, and domination because these moments are visible, dramatic, and easy to remember. But humanity does not live inside moments. Humanity lives inside aftermaths, inside the generations that inherit trauma, inside the children born after wars, inside societies that must function long after victory speeches end. This is where history and humanity diverge. History rewards what ends quickly. Humanity needs what lasts. History rewards certainty. Humanity needs understanding. History rewards those who impose order. Humanity survives through those who preserve dignity. Mercy does not promise victory. It promises continuity. It does not erase injustice. It limits its spread. It does not end conflict. It prevents it from becoming endless. And perhaps this is why mercy feels so unsatisfying to history. It offers no dramatic climax, no clear enemy destroyed, no final resolution, only the quiet refusal to make things worse. But refusing to make things worse may be the most radical act of all, because it demands something history rarely asks for: self-restraint. To be powerful and choose not to use power fully. To be right and choose not to punish. To be victorious and choose not to humiliate. This kind of restraint does not feel heroic. It feels lonely. And loneliness is the price of mercy. The merciful often stand between two fires, condemned by those who demand revenge, distrusted by those who fear softness. They satisfy no extremes, and so they disappear from grand narratives. But their absence from history books does not mean their impact was small. It means their impact cannot be measured in ruins. If history were honest, it would admit this: that its greatest tragedies were not caused by hatred alone, but by the belief that mercy was impossible. That its bloodiest chapters were written not by monsters, but by ordinary people convinced that violence was necessary, and that its quietest moments, the ones barely recorded, were often the moments where humanity barely survived itself. So the final question is not whether history values mercy. It rarely does. The real question is whether we will continue letting history define what strength looks like, whether we will keep mistaking domination for leadership, whether we will keep calling restraint weakness, whether we will keep believing that cruelty is realism. Because every generation inherits the same choice, not between good and evil, but between repetition and interruption, between continuing the cycle or breaking it. History will not help us choose. History will only tell us what happened last time. What happens next belongs to us. And perhaps the greatest act of courage is not to be remembered by history at all, but to act in a way that future generations never need to remember, because nothing catastrophic occurred. No collapse, no massacre, no irreversible wound. Just a quieter world than the one that could have been. History may never reward that choice, but humanity depends on it.